Okay, our next speaker is David Barron, who's the Chief Scientific Officer of the PKD Foundation. David, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you to the forum members for inviting me. I didn't realize I'd be the last panel discussant. I come to you as both a patient and a somewhat lapsed scientist. And I wanted to talk to you about polycystic kidney disease, something which I have, and I've been transplanted, as Dr. Humphreys talked about. It is the most common fatal monogenetic disease that probably many of you have not really heard of or thought much about. It affects one of two genes, PKD1 or PKD2. PKD2 is the more mild phenotype. PKD1 is the predominant one, and about 85% of patients with autosomal dominant PKD have a PKD1 mutation. And it's also the fourth leading cause of renal replacement therapy. So if you think about what Dr. Humphreys was talking about and the expense to Medicare, it's not trivial. For many years, people didn't talk about their PKD in their families because it had insurance issues, it had employment issues, health insurance, life insurance. So in my family, it wasn't until recently that we really talked about it openly. And when I joined the foundation, I was faced with the world suddenly knowing I had PKD. It was a strange experience when I joined the foundation. And the correlation with phenotype and genotype is variable. And I share my mutation with probably less than 2% of the other families that have autosomal dominant PKD. So there's now an active project that is looking for modifier genes that might affect the phenotype of a given mutation. And ADPKD, despite its name, is a systemic ciliopathy. In fact, some people call it the mother of all ciliopathies because there are probably about 600,000 people in the US alone who have ADPKD. And it affects far more than the kidney, and I'll talk about that a little bit going further. I haven't mentioned ARPKD, but that is a similar disease, different gene. It's the fibrocystin protein that's mutated. Again, another ciliary protein. This is a very rare disease that affects children. It's especially devastating because the parents are very unlikely to know that they are at risk for having a child with ARPKD. It also affects the kidneys, but it affects the livers and maturation of the lung because of oligohydramnios. What I'm showing you here is not quite what I looked like just before my double nephrectomy, but it's just to give you an indication that polycystic kidney disease, unlike most common kidney diseases due to hypertension or diabetes, results in the exponential growth of the kidneys probably from prior to birth onwards. And you can see in the upper panel a gentleman who had obviously very large cystic kidneys. These can weigh upwards of 40 pounds, and you can see the effects after a double nephrectomy, which can now be done laparoscopically. And you can see the size of the kidneys. This is courtesy of Dr. Grantham, who's really one of the fathers of the PKD field. So the major issues that confront patients with PKD is increasingly refractory hypertension, infection, hematuria, retroperitoneal bleeds. These can be very serious because it affects your ability to accept a transplant going forward because you're exposed to that blood that may be required with a serious retroperitoneal bleed. Electrolyte imbalances such as hyperkalemia, pain, chronic and acute, there's fatigue, sleep and psychiatric disturbances, and the endpoint that everybody dreads is end-stage renal disease, which requires renal replacement therapy. And as if you've heard, there's a shortage of kidneys. I was very fortunate that a colleague of mine on a moment's notice said, if we're a match, my kidney is your kidney, and I was very fortunate, but many others are not. So you're faced with most likely renal replacement therapy, and that means dialysis. And you've heard from Dr. Humphreys what the implications of that are. And there, as I mentioned, ADPKD is a systemic disease. So there are kidney stones, arachnoid membrane cysts. These tend to run in families, dolichoectasias, mitral valve prolapse, abdominal wall hernias, diverticulosis, and diverticulitis. And you look at this list of other issues, and probably most of them are related to the fact that virtually all cells of the body, or at least most cells of the body, contain a primary cilium, so that this mutation affects obviously more than the kidney, but because of the cost of renal replacement therapy and its implications, these other issues are talked about far less. And in terms of therapeutic advances to date, the current generation is obviously in transplant immunology. I am only on 2 drugs to safely keep my kidney happy. I'm on a steroid-free regimen, so there have been many advances in the ways that people can live and work with transplants. There are obviously better cardiovascular therapies in terms of controlling hypertension and the effects that both declining renal function and hypertension have on the heart. And then the basic science of ADPKD and the polycystins. I was just in Amsterdam for Cilia 2016, 400 scientists from around the world who talked nothing but cilia, not necessarily about PKD, but it's involved in a whole host of interesting ciliopathies, such as left-right symmetry in the embryo and so forth. However, with all this advance in the basic science and how cysts form, and there's still controversy over how the mutation in the cilium actually causes cysts. Recently, it was thought to be a calcium signal, but Dr. Clapham at Harvard showed that this is probably not the case, and there have been no therapeutic advances in the US. Tolvaptan, which has been approved in Canada, the EU, and Japan, and is a vasopressin V2 antagonist, has not yet been approved in the US, and it remains to be seen whether it'll be approved in the US. This I would consider a first therapy. It causes extreme thirst and polyuria, but it has been shown to decrease the growth of cysts over time. So the promise of regenerative medicine. ADPKD is a progressive disease, and actually cysts are probably present prenatally. When one does an ultrasound, which is the simplest way to diagnose ADPKD these days, for every cyst that's seen by ultrasound or even by MRI, there are probably 80 more cysts that are not actually visualized. So the disease, particularly those cases that occur spontaneously, and there are spontaneous mutations accounting for up to 10% of patients with ADPKD, you may not be diagnosed into the 3rd or 4th decade of life, as was my case. And we have talked about the large sum of money that is paid uniquely to people under the age of 65 with renal failure. I calculate that as the 4th leading cause of renal replacement therapy, this probably results in about $4 billion alone just for ADPKD, and that dialysis altogether is probably larger than the entire NIH budget. So I'll make another pitch that Dr. Humphreys made, that line item at NIDDK for renal research needs to be increased because the savings are obvious. The fewer people on dialysis, the greater benefit to Medicare. And the regulatory path to the approval of new and novel PKD therapeutics is still really ill-defined. In this diagram from Dr. Grantham, you see that the kidney grows exponentially over time, and you can see from the age of 15 onwards, At age 30, by the way, if you don't have cysts by ultrasound, you probably don't have the disease. It's virtually certain that you don't. But you can go until your late 40s, perhaps early 50s in the average case, and you see that GFR is maintained over time. And the FDA looks to GFR as a surrogate biomarker, in essence. So a doubling of creatinine, time to end-stage renal disease, 30% decline in GFR. But those are all occurring at the arrow where the curve of GFR starts to decline. And at that point, the number of parenchymal destroying cysts has grown to such an extent that it's my opinion that treatment, even if you show a change in one of those conventional biomarkers for renal disease, it's unlikely that there's enough remaining parenchyma that renal function can be indefinitely maintained at that point. So I think that the therapy needs to be much earlier in the course of disease, and this means that the therapy must be safe and tolerable for perhaps decades. And that leads to a biomarker that actually has been approved by the FDA as a prognostic biomarker to enrich trials, but it hasn't yet been accepted as a surrogate biomarker, a surrogate endpoint, and that's total kidney volume. But as Dr. Grantham likes to say, the cysts are the disease. So we're currently working with the FDA, NIH, academia, and industry to advance TKV from a prognostic biomarker to a surrogate endpoint. So as I mentioned, tolvaptan is available ex-US. Part of the reason it was not approved is it causes an increase in liver enzymes in some patients. So for example, in Canada, if you're prescribed the drug, you enter into a contract with your nephrologist to have your blood tested for liver function every month for 18 months, is my understanding. And there are a variety of ongoing trials with tolvaptan, as I mentioned, in a phase 3B study. There's drug repurposing. Metformin, pioglitazone, niacinamide are all in pilot clinical trials. The tyrosine kinase inhibitors, particularly tesavatinib, is in a phase 2A study now. The mTOR pathway inhibitors have been somewhat disappointing. And in Europe, somatostatin analogs are currently in particularly lanreotide is in a phase 3 clinical trial. And this is one of the issues with PKD. It's a very complex disease that this little cilium, 1/10,000th the volume of the distal tubular or collecting duct cell, invokes so many different pathways. And this is just around mTOR, but you can look at the vasopressin pathway, you can look at electrolyte channels. Where do you start? And it's not clear that any of the drugs currently being considered will really address all these pathways. So what are the regenerative medicine options? I think Dr. Humphreys handled this with far more knowledge than I can, but there are currently, for people that can afford it, there's embryo selection at the 32-cell stage. There are directed drug delivery options, and this might be for other diseases as well, kidney diseases, such as folate receptor payloads, IgA transporting a payload into the cyst itself, autologous corrected stem cell infusion. This has been demonstrated in rodents. Exosomes we've talked about. Turns out they contain polycystin, which is a very large protein, about 4,300 amino acids, or PC1 mRNA. Again, this has been demonstrated to decrease the rate of growth in cysts. Autologous corrected kidney organoids, this is a long ways off in my opinion. And we've heard a lot of press about so-called implantable non-immunologic hybrid kidneys with both cells and engineering, but I think until there's more data available, it's unclear where this will go. So the generality of PKD to other renal diseases is that it's about nephron regeneration or cell repair, and that obviously occurs to some extent, in that through hyperfiltration, you see that plateau of GFR that's maintained over time. I think there's an applicability of the research in ADPKD to the whole family of ciliopathies. And the promise to regenerative medicine, obviously, is the avoidance of renal replacement therapy. And we need well-informed patients to be able to assess risk-benefit and assist the FDA and other regulatory agencies in deciding what drugs or therapies to go forward with. And I just end with a few references, and thank you very much for your attention.